Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many people here today, especially on a wonderful summer's day. My name's Howard Cox, and for those of you who don't know me too well, I was the founder of Fairfield UK for the last 15 years. We've kept fuel duty frozen, and I'm now the proud candidate here, standing as MP for Dover and Deal. So I'm very proud to introduce very much an icon for me, an inspiration to me. That's the Honorary President of Reform UK Party, Nigel Farage.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Dover. Welcome to the front line of the great national debate on immigration, both illegal and legal. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel this general election campaign has got off to the dullest start I can ever remember in my entire life. Two men with the appearance and enthusiasm of middle managers vying to become our national leader. Indeed, I do my best to listen to Keir Starmer when he's being interviewed or giving a speech, and I find myself just zoning out halfway through. There's no energy, there's no optimism, and there's no real substantive policy. As for the Prime Minister, well, I have to laugh. The word bold, that's the word they keep using. Bold leadership. But actually, when he's asked a question by anybody, he looks rather more like a frightened rabbit than somebody that is bold. Now, I'll be getting questions later, I know, about the fact that I decided not to stand. I am, of course, very disappointed. I did have a 6-month plan, which would have had me fighting a seat and campaigning around the country. I felt in 6 weeks that I couldn't simply do both. But what I can talk about with some authority is this subject that has affected this harbour at Dover and indeed most of our country over the last few years. It was pretty obvious to me early in 2020 that the trickle of small inflatable rib dinghies that were coming across the English Channel was something that would turn into a flood. But nobody was interested. Nobody was talking about it. And so I came down to Dover. I went out to sea repeatedly. I filmed the dinghies coming over. I filmed the processing centre here in Dover Docks. I went up to the Midlands and elsewhere to film the hotels that these people were being put into. And I said at the time that you might as well put a big sign on the White Cliffs of Dover saying everyone welcome, because we'd stopped deporting people who'd arrived in our country illegally. And it's quite a thought that in the last year of the Labour government, leading up to 2010, 45,000 people who came to Britain illegally had been deported. But we'd given up on that. So I said that I thought, unless something dramatic was done, that there would be an invasion. Now, of course, for using that word, I was called all the names under the sun. But 3,800 boats later, 125,000 people later, you can use whatever word you want. I happen to think that invasion, frankly, was pretty appropriate. So I've campaigned hard on this issue throughout this 4-year period, and I'm going to say to you, frankly, I was ahead of the curve on this. I was right. And that's kind of what I've done in my career. I'm an issues campaigner above all. So nobody was talking about it when I started, but you're all talking about it now. And it's worth bearing in mind that 86% of those that come are male, and nearly all of them under the age of 40, most under the age of 30. Unsurprisingly, it's led to a very big national debate. People see the unfairness of it. They say, how can it be that we're on social housing waiting lists for a year, perhaps 2 years, when these people that come illegally are put straight into 4-star hotels or, if not that, private accommodation? How can it be that those that come have access to dental care when we can't get an NHS dentist? And I think the fact that the hotels alone are costing over £7 million a day makes people pretty upset. Those that have come into the country legally aren't very happy about it either, because they've gone through costs, time and hoops to be in the country the right way. But it's the other element of this that I want to focus on today. Frankly, I think this is very dangerous. You only have to look at what's happened in Sweden, in cities like Malmö, to see that a large influx of young males coming from an entirely different culture, and certainly coming from a culture in which women are not even regarded as second-class citizens, has had, frankly, disastrous social effects. But since the events of October the 7th and what has happened in Gaza and increased radicalisation in the Middle East, this is even more of a problem. You see, these young men that come, and I've actually filmed this, I've filmed on the 12-mile median line, people throwing their iPhones into the sea, throwing their passports into the sea, doing everything they can so that we can't track and identify them. Although it's okay, because they get an iPhone, a new one, within 24 hours of arrival. But I think this is a national security issue. Now, if you think I'm being over the top, let's have a think about our friend Donald Tusk, who I did battle with in the European Parliament many times, very much an EU lovey, now, of course, the Prime Minister of Poland. He has talked about the wave of, and I'm using his words, not mine, aggressive young males that are coming into Poland, having crossed the Mediterranean, and he has said that this is now a matter of national security for Poland. Well, I put it to you that if it's a matter of national security in Poland, I think what we ought to be doing with this situation here is declaring a national security emergency. And this is an emergency. I talked over the course of the weekend to Trevor Phillips about the small but worryingly growing number of young men, predominantly young men, in this country, adopting radical views, views that aren't just un-British, but views that frankly are extremely anti-British. We saw the recent local elections, candidates being elected in inner city districts, in Leeds, in Burnley and elsewhere. We saw the aggression. And you might have noticed that Angela Rayner yesterday was campaigning in her constituency, begging a group of Muslim leaders to please vote Labour. You'll have noticed not a single woman in the room. So we're moving into an age in our inner cities and towns, I'm afraid, I'm worried to say, of sectarian politics with women completely excluded. I have to say that the Rwanda policy is something that was plucked out of the air by a desperate Conservative government, launched just down the coast at Lyd Airport 2 years and 1 month ago. And Rishi Sunak, of course, has inherited that from Boris Johnson and keeps making promises that planes will go to Rwanda. I am absolutely convinced that the overriding reason for calling a snap early general election is because he knows those planes in July, as he promised, would not be going to Rwanda. They weren't going to go. Rishi can't stop the boats. And he can't stop the boats for the very same reason that the first aeroplane that was on the tarmac and ready to go was stopped, if you remember, by a judgment from a single so-called judge. I say so-called because most of the judges in the European Court of Human Rights haven't actually been legally trained. They're jurists, which is a very odd European concept, at least to us. And he knows that it won't happen. He knows that despite everything that they put in the legislation which disapplies Articles 2 and 3 of the Human Rights Act 1998, he knows that an international treaty goes over, above and beyond that. And planes not going to Rwanda would see the failure of what he believes to be his flagship policy. And that's where the other R comes in. That's where the reform vote, he feared, would have gone a lot higher. So I genuinely believe that's the reason why we've got this early general election. The Conservative policy on Rwanda does not work. We are, I'm afraid, in a situation where our leaders do not have courage to do different. As for the Labour policy, well, frankly, it is a joke. They haven't got a policy. They say get tough on the criminal gangs. We've been saying for decades in this country we would get tough on the criminal drugs gangs. But has that made any difference to the supply of illegal substances? Far from it. In fact, they're being consumed today by more people and in greater quantities than ever before. Those gangs over there on the other side, and we're talking about some very ruthless people, some very dangerous people, those gangs on the other side can make €2 to €3 million a week during the months of June, July, August, September, if we get a clear spell of weather. We won't be seeing any boats today. One did set off, but it's gone back. The weather was too bad. So there's no way just going for the gangs is going to make any difference. And in fact, he's even talking about joining up with an EU scheme that might finish up with us taking more people than we are at this moment in time. Neither side has any credible policy at all. The point about Brexit, whether you agree with it or not, it was about restoring sovereignty. It was about being in control. And there is no doubt that the issue that pushed the turnout up in 2016 to numbers that nobody anticipated was the issue of immigration. Mostly, actually, legal immigration, but we'll talk much more about that later on this week. To Brexit voters, what is happening in the English Channel is a serious affront. And they see, frankly, us allowing it to continue as being a betrayal of what they voted for in the referendum and what they entrusted the Conservatives with in that general election and that massive 80-seat majority in 2019. And I have to say, I feel that too, because if you remember, we stood aside. The forerunner to reform, the Brexit Party, stood aside in 319 seats to give the Conservatives a clear run. We didn't want a Corbyn, Lib Dem, SNP coalition, a second referendum, and all that would have gone with it. We must leave ECHR if we want to have sovereignty over our borders. It's just as simple as that. The other parties don't want to do it. And we have to make it very clear, as Tony Abbott did, who of course was the Prime Minister of Australia, who faced exactly the same problem. The only difference was the boats were bigger. They were coming from Indonesia, they were travelling longer distances, they had more people on board. But it was exactly the same issue. They tried all sorts of things. They tried offshore processing, that led to huge rows. In the end, what Abbott said was that nobody that comes to Australia illegally via criminal traffickers on this sea route will ever be given permanent leave to remain. And we have to make that clear. And it's not because we're hard-hearted or bad. I mean, remember this. We've actually allowed 500,000 people to get refugee status in Britain since 2016. We've actually, historically, always been one of the most generous countries in the world when it comes to giving refugee status to those genuinely in fear of their lives. And the other thing that we have to do is we have to have a proper conversation with Monsieur Macron. Hundreds of millions of pounds we've given the French already. I accept on the one hand they have a difficult job because there's roughly 100 miles of beaches from which they can launch these dinghies. There are huge areas of sand dunes. It's very difficult to stop all of the boats. Many would criticise the French police and say they haven't done enough, but it's missing the point. What I showed 4 years ago in the first video I ever did from the channel was escorting. And what happens here is, once a dinghy, and it can be just 200 yards off the beach at Gravelines or wherever it may be, and the French Navy escort the boat all the way to a 12-mile or median line, whereby they hand over the boats and the people to Border Force or the RNLI. The French Navy are aiding and abetting the criminal trafficking gangs. And actually what they should be doing is, which something the Belgians have done to a certain degree, is they should be taking those boats back to mainland France. We have to make it absolutely clear to the French, we will not accept that continued practice of escorts. But without ECHR, none of this is actually going to happen. This is a massive political issue. It's an issue that I've been ahead of the curve on. It's an issue that I've been right on. No one was talking about it then, but you're all talking about it now. And I'm looking forward to a proper, open Q&A with the press, something I don't think the other parties seem to like to do these days. Thank you very much indeed.